Johnny is?
Six minutes half, period. Third one in. One, two, three, fourth one in. From the center aisle. Right on top of the tail.
I can't see you.
show gratitude for the knowledge and love which you have made to dwell with us and in us, who live forever and ever. As Chancellor of St. John's University, in the name of the sponsoring medical universities, and in the name of the Executive Governing Board and the Board of Regents, I herewith call into session this 125th commencement convocation for the conferring of the academic degrees granted by the university. Before I ask Father Hilbert Chimish to take charge of these exercises, I would like to use this opportunity to thank our outgoing president, Father Michael Flecker. From 1971 to this February, he functioned as an energetic and skilled president of this university, adding to the richness of our academic programs, financial procedures, and physical plant, especially the work of the Lesser and the renovated library. In the name of St. John's community, I wish to thank him for his work and wish him well as he becomes president of the Berkeley Theological Union.
It's good to be here today, and I hope you have found your 4 years here good. And will want to come back from time to time. I want to take this occasion to thank the faculty and the staff for their work this past year. I'm a late comer to it this year. But I am immensely impressed with the quality and the integrity of the people who work at St. John's, who are part of St. John's. I especially want to single out today Mr. Stephen Humphrey, who is retiring after what is in effect a lifetime at St. John's as a teacher of English, as a pillar of the community. He has set the standard for us all, and we will miss him. Now there's a happy innovation this year. Seniors asked to have their own speaker, and I was delighted to accede to this request, because I'm quite sure that Rob Culligan, who was chosen, will speak well. He was born in St. Paul. He lived for 9 years in Europe, came to St. John's 4 years ago, has distinguished himself academically, plans to go on to law school. He is an avid sports fan, an intramural competitor in football, basketball, and softball. His Italian and French are good, and he also does nicely in English, as has been evidenced by his leading role in the Forum, our local society for debate. In other words, he is a typical St. John's senior.
defeated by Atlanta. It was the enormous sense of freedom which we had suddenly acquired. As we joyfully waved goodbye to Mom and Dad, we realized that we were at liberty to kick back, sleep in all day, blow out the classes, rally every Thursday night at the lot, and continuously ride many buses to and from St. Joe in a desperate attempt to find some companionship after being dumped by the once faithful hometown honey. We also had more radical freedoms to refuse to shave and shower, refuse to eat the infamous tuna tacos refuse to put the sheets on the beds for months at a time, and even to refuse to leave the dirt cellar at closing time if we so wished. When we look back at our freedom and the crazy actions which accompanied it, it's a wonder that any of us are here today. In fact, it seems that one of the toughest aspects of our education was learning to apply the brakes to our freedom through reason and self-control. And this task wasn't made any easier, especially for myself, by the fact that some very common advice at that time for any problem was, have a beer, cops, and blow it off. Somehow, amidst this tremendous freedom, roughly 2/3 of the freshmen from that year are still with us today. I like to think that this success rate can be attributed to our ability to mature and accept responsibility, and it's not just a product of good fortune. George Bernard Shaw adds credibility to this view when he states, liberty means responsibility. That's why most men dread it. But freedom isn't the only force which ignites responsibility. Our responsibility seems to be enhanced most often by our intellectual and moral growth. As we become educated, we gain a greater sense of obligation and duty. As we become more conscious, we become more conscientious. And as we achieve greater heights of awareness, we automatically acquire more accountability both for our actions and the actions of others around us. For when we receive the gifts of education in the forms of the ability to think, listen, give, and learn, then we as individual persons have the potential to change and improve worldly conditions. To ignore this potential by defying our responsibility is a violation against ourselves and against the other people around us. Yep, today we are graduating, but our education and our responsibility has just begun. Now is not the time to set aside all that we have learned, but rather to live that which we see to be right. The key to our success in the future depends upon how effectively we can implement the human values and truths that we have discovered here at St. John's. For it is our role in helping other people and fostering human cooperation, which is the essence of life, the key to our future, and the criterion by which we ultimately will be judged. Victor Delorier Jr., a Native American, put it well when he said, "The future of mankind lies waiting for those who will come to understand their lives and take up their responsibilities to all living things." To all living things. Above all, I think that responsibility dictates that we should not leave St. John's with the sole objective of achieving economic success. If our only dream is to own a big house, drive 2 cars, and cruise the lakes on a speedboat, then we haven't learned anything at all from our liberal arts education. We must live whole lives in union with others, not empty ones guided by self-interest. The greatest thing we can possibly do once we leave here sacrifice, much like the sacrifices which many of our parents made to send us here. Secondly, it requires that we are active and concerned with every possible human issue, ranging from nuclear disarmament to environmental protection. Silent acknowledgement and apathy are to be avoided like the plague. In fact, apathy is a twofold crime. It's a crime against ourselves because it involves the betrayal of our minds and our conscience, and it's a crime against others because it involves the betrayal of those who need our attentions and our resources most of all. If educated people, such as ourselves, who have immeasurable mental potential, economic resources, freedoms, and opportunities, do not attempt to become involved in the betterment of the human condition, then we have committed an unforgivable offense. For if we're not willing to be accountable for the injustices in the world, then who is? Our ancestors? Our children? No one? Only when we learn that there's no one left to blame but ourselves, and only when we learn that being human involves being responsible, can we truly enjoy the freedoms which abound and at the same time live fuller, more human lives. This reality is best expressed in the words of Reinhold Niebuhr, a 20th century American clergyman. Niebuhr states that life has no meaning except in terms of responsibility. I hope that as you and I leave this university, we will realize how blessed we have been to develop the potential to use our minds. But more importantly, I hope we realize that we have paid a non-economic price for our education. From here on, our hearts and minds will be continually challenged by the call of responsibility. This call will involve an obligation to think and question our actions and the actions of every institution in all governments. But above all, it will involve an inherent duty to listen and to give to other individuals. We do have responsibilities, and it's no longer September of 1978. Before I rejoin the senior class for the remainder of the ceremony, I'd like to say that our growth over the past several years has not been a product just of our own doings. The talents and knowledge we have acquired have been bestowed upon us by the faculty, the administration, the parents, and the Benedictine community. In the name of the entire graduating class, I'd like to thank all these people for passing on these most precious gifts. I hope that we successfully show our appreciation to them by carrying forth our responsibilities to the next generation, just as this generation has passed them on to us. Thank you for allowing me to represent you. Thank you for listening, and have a very, very pleasant afternoon.
John Hassler grew up in Todd County and graduated from St. John's in 1955. I told him I wasn't going to give a lot of biographical details. Suffice it to say that he is an English teacher who writes novels. In 1980, he won a Guggenheim Fellowship John came back to St. John's from Brainerd Community College, where he was teaching, and found a quiet room in Wimmer Hall, the old library, where the muses lingered. There he completed his 5th book, The Love Hunter, which was published last June and is his most celebrated book to date. This year he has continued at St. John's as writer in residence, teaching fiction and working on his next novel, which he tells me will be completed on August 31st. His muse is quite dependent. He writes about what he knows, Minnesota and people. He embodies in himself and in his writing qualities that we like to think and education at St. John's fosters. A sense of proportion, which includes a sense of humor, a sense of human worth, of the connection between where we are and who we are. He has a sharp eye for who we are and a mature appreciation for where we are. I'm sure these talents will be apparent in his commencement address, the Belikov Syndrome. I'm delighted to present John Haston.
Greetings, new graduates, and to all who have come here to wish you well. If I hadn't rejected it for sounding too dismal, the title of this talk might have been Burnouts I Have Known. The subject of vocational burnout has been on my mind ever since I delivered a commencement address in a small high school in northern Minnesota, where I was seated on the stage next to the superintendent of schools. As we sat there watching the graduates come forward to receive their degrees or their diplomas from the president of the school board, I was astonished to hear the superintendent muttering into my ear about how much he hated his work. And he spoke in the bitterest terms. He said the town was provincial, the men and women of the town were ignorant, and the students, he said, and he pointed to 10 or 12 examples, were savages. He said that he would soon qualify for his pension, and he could hardly wait. Now, please put yourselves in my place. It was one of those rare moments in life when two opposing alternatives are so tangible that you can reach out and touch them. In front of me were 4 dozen 18-year-olds wearing their caps and gowns and expressions of hope. Beside me was a man coming to the end of his career in a state of absolute cynicism. In front of me, punctuated by flashbulbs, was that community's most important ceremony of the year. And beside me, the man who had organized the ceremony was insisting in the gloomiest terms that the community was not worthy of him. I came away believing that I had never seen such a graphic case of the Belikov Syndrome, which is my term for life avoidance, which is also my term for what I see in people who suffer from severe cases of burnout. By life avoidance, I mean the constant desire to hold life, and especially one's vocation in life, at arm's length,
I mean the refusal to immerse oneself in the stream of the human condition. I call it the Beloukov syndrome because Chekhov portrays it so graphically in a short story about a man named Beloukov, who was a schoolmaster in 19th century Russia. And the story is entitled, appropriately, The Man Who Lived in the Shell. And this is one of the opening paragraphs. You have heard of Beloukov, no doubt. The curious thing about him was that he wore rubbers and a warm coat with an inner lining, and carried an umbrella even in the finest weather. And he kept the umbrella in its cover and his watch in a gray chamois case. And when he took out his penknife to sharpen his pencil, his penknife too was in a little case. And his face seemed to be in a case as well, because it was always hidden by his turned-up collar. He wore dark spectacles and a sweater, stuffed his ears with cotton wool, and when he got into a carriage, he always told the driver to put up the hood. In short, the man showed a constant and irrepressible inclination to keep a covering about himself, to create for himself a membrane, as it were, which would isolate him from outside influences. Actuality irritated him. How could actuality possibly irritate us? We wonder on the day we receive our bachelor's degree or our master's degree. On that day, for most of us, life is still too fresh to irritate us, or bore us, or repel us. When I left this university 27 years ago, what did I know about burnout? In those days, as now, literature was my guidebook to life, but Graham Greene had not yet published his novel, A Burnt-Out Case. I had seen Hamlet, but was more interested in the sordid way than in Hamlet's decision to be or not to be. It was only after I went out and took up my vocation that I saw the symptoms of life avoidance firsthand among my colleagues and discovered the germ of it in myself, and by reading closer, realized that authors had been writing about it for centuries. So now I'm back to say 7 things about burnout. For all I know, my 7 discoveries might be old discoveries, but each one in its time was news to me. 1. The less tangible rewards of a particular profession, the higher the incidence of burnout. Teaching, for example. That strange profession that has us constantly giving away all we know. Indeed, more than that, all we think we know. And giving it to people who seldom come back to tell us what they did. Which is not to say that most teachers are burnouts. The vast majority of teachers that I have known have been supremely conscientious. But we are all acquainted with that 2 or 4 or 6% who are so lethargic that the high point of their school year is the day they go on strike. Perhaps if Shakespeare were writing today, he would make Hamlet not a prince, but a principal. 2, no one is immune from burnout. No one is immune from the Beloukov syndrome, the periodic urge to give up and withdraw. No matter how zealous you are about your calling, there comes a day when the novelty of your vocation disappears, and you discover that the race you entered was not, as you thought, the 100-yard dash in front of the grandstand. The 100-yard dash isn't even on the program. And what you're running instead is the cross-country marathon, which only begins and ends in front of the grandstand. Between the degree and the pension, you do a lot of running won't say what year or at which high school, but it was January. I was standing on hall duty outside my classroom between period 2 and period 3, and wondering as never before where in the world I would find the strength to persevere through periods 4 and 5 and 6 and February, March, April, May. And I was doubly disheartened because I was really quite fond of teaching. And how could a job I liked be so hard? My students had turned into cannibals, it seemed, consuming me by eating away at my spirit. I felt I had to somehow quit giving so much of myself away. Now, as it happened, there were 2 veteran burnouts on that faculty who for years had been going about the business of not teaching, and I took a sudden interest in their methods. One of these was the history teacher who showed films of World War II for 5 hours a day. 5 days a week. And the other, the physical education teacher, threw out a ball and said to his class, "Go chase it." Now, I had just enough imagination left to be dissatisfied with those 2 methods, and so I devised my own, or I should say, a certain book company devised one for me. For this was the era when the programmed learning textbook first came upon the scene. This was a kind of super workbook which led the students through the syllabus by a clever system of questions and answers to save the teacher the trouble of teaching. There was in that school a room full of these workbooks, which the school board had bought from a zealous book salesman, whose rewards had been so tangible that the district mill rate had to be raised. I issued those workbooks to my classes, and I sat at my desk, never having to come out of my shell, except to answer some rare question the workbook couldn't handle, such as what's for hot lunch. This was life avoidance in its pure form. And within a week, I was alarmed to discover that a crippling sort of malaise was spreading out from my teaching and pervading all my waking hours. The following week, I gathered up the workbooks, along with my strength, and went back to giving myself away to my students, having made discovery number 3, namely, the fatigue of overwork is nothing compared to the fatigue of doing nothing. Pascal knew this approximately 300 years before I did. Pascal defined the awful consequences of burnout in the year 1650, when he wrote, "Nothing is so insufferable to man as to be completely at rest, without passions, without business, without diversion, without study. There will immediately arise from the depth of his heart weariness, gloom, sadness, fretfulness, vexation, and despair." And it was those very things, weariness, gloom, vexation, and despair, that I was hearing from that superintendent that night, who was speaking to me from inside his shell. 4, we all carry around within ourselves the seeds of life avoidance, and for good reason. We all need respite from our calling. We all need to step out of the marathon from time to time and sit in the shade. That's what vacations and retreats and leisure time are for. And professions that do not have a system of sabbaticals ought to institute. There is a term for such measured withdrawal. It's called rest, and it serves as an immunization against burnout. But the danger is in assuming that if a little withdrawal is good, a lot of too remote from life to relate to her. He had spent so much of his life evading life that he no longer knew how to live. His shell had grown too tough, and he couldn't hatch. 5, be forewarned, the vocation you love, like a person you love, will make the most demands on you. I found this fact illustrated recently in a novel by Shirley Bassey entitled Transit of Venus. One of her characters, a dedicated astronomer, has gone off to a foreign country to oversee the installation of an enormous telescope. And he writes this in a letter home. What an atrocious, sustained effort is required, I find, to learn or do anything thoroughly, especially if it's what you love. A vocation is a source of difficulty, not ease. To do is difficult enough. To be, more difficult still. To do or to be, there's a difference. It's one thing to teach and another to be a teacher. It's one thing to write and another to be a writer. The difference is in the degree of investment. To do is to fulfill your job description. To be is to invest so much of yourself into your calling that you and your calling begin to blend. We have all known certain teachers or nurses or parents or carpenters or clergy or shopkeepers whose dedication made them the emblem of their calling for us. A natural style is Pascal's term for this. And speaking of a book he admired, Pascal wrote this: when we see a natural style, we are astonished and delighted, for we expected to see an author, and we find instead a human being. This, then, is the opposite of the Mallinckrodt syndrome. Instead of drawing, invest. It requires great effort and leads to great satisfaction. It's been my observation that those men and women in whom the flame of dedication burns the highest are the least likely to burn out. Or to put it another way, the more of yourself you invest in your calling, the more interesting your calling becomes. We are all narcissistic enough to be intrigued by our own reflection, and the more of ourselves we see reflected in our work, the longer it holds our interest. Without investment, there is no interest. 6, most burnouts I've known have been men. And this is a profession which is almost equally divided between men and women. I believe this is because a man is less likely than a woman to keep his mind alive after college. In other words, a man is less likely to read books. I don't mean self-help books and trade manuals. I mean books generally, fiction and non-fiction, which serve to stretch the mind and keep it agile. Go forth and read books, I've been saying for 27 years to my students. And all of my students have promised me they would do so. The boys as well as the girls, the men as well as the women. And then I began publishing books and discovered that precisely 5 out of 6 people who read books and think about books and respond to books are women. In the days when I was addressing civic groups and study clubs about my books, I was invited to a dozen women's clubs before I was invited to a man's club. And so I thought it was a great breakthrough when the program chairman of the Rotary Club Telling myself that at last I had found a group of literate men, I said, yes, I would be happy to speak on Tuesday. And the program chairman said, that's wonderful, because Tuesday is Ladies' Day, and we like to have something for the ladies. So I say it once more. I challenge the men of this class to break out of the masculine stereotype that has me believing that the last thing a man is likely to read is his degree, and to keep in mind that if graduation marked the end of intellectual development, it wouldn't be called commencement. 7. Every burnout I've known has come to the point of thinking, usually by mistake, that he is unsuited for his work. Either he will come to believe that he is not worthy of his work, or, and this is more common, that his work is not worthy of him. Sometimes that's true, but more often it's not. I have been struck by the almost miraculous instinct people have for matching themselves up to work that suits them. In the burnout's case, the problem is usually not his being in the wrong profession, but rather his faulty vision of that profession. By this I mean most burnouts are either too nearsighted or too farsighted. The nearsighted become so preoccupied with small irritations and interruptions, that is, the actualities of their calling, that they lose sight of their long-range aspirations. The farsighted, on the other hand, spend so much time dreaming of their long-range aspirations that they have trouble dealing with the day-to-day actualities. I am reminded of what it was like when I was a boy to walk a rail. If I didn't watch my feet, I lost my balance. If I didn't look down the track, I lost my balance. The trick was to do both at once. I conclude with 2 quotations illustrating that success requires a balance between the nearsighted and the farsighted, a combination of the visionary and the mundane. About the mundane, C.S. Lewis says this: the great thing, if one can, is to stop regarding all the unpleasant things as interruptions in one's real life. The truth is that what one calls the interruptions are precisely one's real life, the life God is sending one day by day. And about the visionary, I quote from Henry David Thoreau. This is a passage I wrote on a card and pinned to the wall over my typewriter when I began the first draft of my first novel, and when my prose was becoming especially prosaic, it helped to look up and see this. If one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined,
we are assembled. By virtue of the authority committed to me, I confer upon you the degrees of Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Arts, Master of Divinity, and Master of Arts, which have been approved by the faculty of the university and for which you have been recommended. The respective deans will please have the candidates come forward.
The degree of Bachelor of Arts in Raging Cum Laude is conferred upon Stephen Paul White, Christopher Edward Palmer. The degree of Bachelor of Science in Raging Cum Laude is conferred upon Robert E. Starr. Bachelor of Science in Cum Laude, Michael Gerard Hemingway, Timothy James Hayden, Charles Anthony Jennison, Stephen Eugene Bloch, Patrick H. Littberg, Daniel Gilson Mulvane, Richard J. Schweigen, Robert Jerome White. Bachelor of Arts, summa cum laude, Paul Henry Eikens, Thomas Christopher Layton, Dwayne Evan Pulaski, Brian Gerard Cookhouse, Edward H. Riley II, Kent Patrick Sticka, Gregory James Beaver. Bachelor of Science, magna cum laude, James Keith Adams, Paul James Carson, Michael Wayne Haas, Alan Robert Hauser, Todd Michael Hess, David Jerome Stangler. Bachelor of Arts, magna cum laude, Robert Eugene Culligan, Anthony William Norman, Laura Anton Hoyman, Keith Ralph Bauer, Michael Eugene O'Keefe, Stephen Patrick Power, John F. Burr. Bachelor of Science, cum laude, Robert C. Madden, Stephen Michael Vedder, George Michael Brewster, John Mark Kavanaugh, Gregory C. G. Eichmann, Michael James Krumholz, Matthew A. Ritchie, Daniel W. Reeks, Michael Allen Roth, Michael Allen Schmitz, Richard David Keegan, Mark Gerard Craner, Neil S. Wagner. Bachelor of Arts, cum laude, James Francis Condon, Stephen Michael Lehman, Daniel J. O'Loughlin, James A. Phelps, Dave Probst, Anthony B. Sinner, Caesar Anthony Cabot, Thomas J. Burka, Thomas James Bobrecht, J. Scott Wagner. Bachelor of Science, Timothy Patrick Guion,
Stephen Philip Wolf, Timothy John Rader, Gary John Janjik, Robert Thomas Fisher, Michael James O'Leary, Robert John Kuczynski, Marvin Kenneth Schulte, Darrell Roy Henson, David Kamal Fournier, Charles Eugene Zabinski, Michael John Flynn, Richard Clark Spila, Joseph Patrick Chambers, Gary Raymond Kellen, William Edward Conger, James Richard McQuillan, Jeffrey Edwin Hofro, Joel Oscar Severson, Gregory James Doyle, Thomas Joseph Torber, Robert Thomas Potter, Mark Robert Wolter, Scott Raymond Doninger, Paul Andrew Burchett, Patrick Michael Smith, John Frank Zimmercheck, Vincent Eldon Wooden, Barry Richard Rick, Michael Dennis Johnson, Paul Thomas Snow, Anthony John Voss, Jeffrey William Peterson, Stephen Joseph Dinosti, David Allen Rogotsky, Terrence Kenneth Pumper, Gregory John Marzali, Scott David Martin, Dale Jerome Beasley, Larry John Rickman, Stephen Robert O'Shea, David James Culligan, Matthew James Whitters, Timothy John Russell, Thomas John Hendricks, Stephen Gerard Carlson, Michael D. Nielsen, Russell Edward Benjamin, David Daniel Lenari, Matthew Wall Schwab, Richard George Robert, William John Powell, Gary Michael Foster, Stephen Michael Foster, John Joseph McCarthy, Thomas Joseph Clemson, Randall Gerald Logan, Richard Mark Schroeder, Marcus Edward Reicher, Timothy Stephen Gates, James Walter Pachowski, Jeffrey James Young, Peter Dale Magnuson, Mark Victor Flash, Benedict John Peter Martinka, Dennis William Garza, Mark Joseph Reeves, William John Cashman, Kevin Christopher Eichhardt, Martin John Merritt, Joseph Robert Unruh, John Michael Casper, Timothy Allen Tyson, John Thomas Trout, Russell John Lang, John Kevin Bochavar, David Stewart Martin, Daniel John Casey, Joseph Conrad Spells, James John Sewell, Frederick Charles Lang II, Timothy Michael Fleming, Peter Mark Westcross, Kofi Clemena Cora, Jeffrey Blaine Fronthorst, Martin Clemens Cowell, John Anthony Price, James Matthias Matthias, James W. Peppermont, Robert Clark Klein, Joseph Michael Leo, Mark Wayne Van Orson, Dennis Eugene Bowe, George Stack Murphy Ortega. Thomas John Heisler. James Patrick Jewett. Kevin Peter Lara. Daniel Joseph Rico. Thomas Joseph Nitty. Gregory Van Augusta. Ben Jerome Collada. Anthony Eugene Sampere. Peter Andrew Thomas. Stephen James Bauer. James Patrick Mercer. Scott John Mason. Thomas Patrick Perry. Timothy J. Quick. Thomas R. Height. James Francis Siebert. Joseph George Lomrick. John Eric Height. Kelly Thomas Frank. Richard Walter Lippert. David William Lytle. Carl Oswald Foley. James Robert Thompson. Stephen Robert Farrer. Stephen Michael Addison. Matthew James Reed. Robert Paul Stankley. Francisco Bergoven and Denarcy Messa. Paul Michael French. Edgar Charles Ray. Sean Michael Gallagher. Eric Joseph Oakland. Thomas Paul Layton. Curtis D. Cotter.
soon as possible. John R. Piazza. Leslie John Niemeyer. Paul Christopher Potter. Brother Paul Schweitz of the Order of St. Benedict. And Ronald L. Wires. The candidates for the degree of Master of Arts, please come forward. The degree of Master of Arts in Theology is conferred upon Sister Shawn Caruth of the Order of St. Benedict. Sister Jean Garrity of the Order of Preachers. Sister Hilda Keller of the Order of St. Benedict. Brother B. Perry of the Order of St. Benedict. And Anthony Stanton. The degree of Master of Arts in Religious Education is conferred upon Sister Mary Ellen Backus of the Ursuline Sisters. John Philip Boyle. Sister Caroline Golden of the Order of St. Francis. Lori Ann Reinhardt. And Jacqueline Mary Wick. The degree of Master of Arts in Liturgical Studies is conferred upon Sister Joanne Dupont of the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. Brother Paul Jasper, the Order of St. Benedict, and Lizette Larson.
We want to confer the Fox Christie Award this year on Dr. Gordon Charles Zahn. Dr. Zahn Your creative and courageous scholarship has produced books and articles that have deepened the discussion regarding war and peace. You have repeatedly called our attention to the major source of distress in our century, the spirit of violence which permeates our national and international life. You have placed your trust in the political potential of individual moral responsibility. You are a professor and servant of our primitive, authentic, and original faith through your life, teaching, and writing. Your ability to engage in dialogue, to respect those who disagree, to proceed with charity at all times, is a remarkable example. Your writings have inspired many men and women to examine conscientiously their society and their own lives. You have witnessed and reminded us again and again that Christianity is a spiritual way. The signals you send have helped invite us Benedictines back to our roots and forward in our common search for peace. For these reasons, we, the academic community of St. John's University, College of Minnesota, in our 125th year, are pleased to present to you our Pax Christi Award. I will ask Frank Ziegler, Director of the Alumni Association, to speak.
Before I begin my 90-minute prepared commentary, Terry, Father Hillary asked me to make two announcements. The first announcement is that following graduation, there will be life as well as life voyages. The second announcement is that even if you don't read books after you graduate, please read your quarterly St. John's magazine. It's a bit trite, perhaps redundant to say that it's a pleasure to be here, but it is always a pleasure for me to be at St. John's. 20 plus years that I've been coming back here. It's also a pleasure to be here when I really don't have anything to do. Your program says you're being inducted into the Alumni Association. There's really nothing I can do to facilitate that. What you brought to St. John's and what you've done with it over the last several years determine your status as an alumnus or alumna. There's a danger in doing, I think. Perhaps some of you have been intimidated by the question in recent months. What are you going to do after graduation? I know I'd be intimidated if any of you asked me, what does an alumnus do? I really don't know. Some people may say, well, they go to stand-ups, they come back for homecoming, they give money, they recruit football players. I suppose all of those are true. But it's really not what you do, it's what you are. So all I'd like to say is welcome. And I guess wish you two things. Number one, success in whatever it is that you do. And wish that you too will find pleasure in coming back here. Thank you and good luck.
extend his message of peace and reconciliation. May he be with us as we walk the path of concern